The eccentricities, political manoeuvrings and off-the-board tactics of modern chess are often thought to have begun with Bobby Fischer. But in fact, he was only following a pattern that had been set 100 years before by another American, a man called Paul Morphy. In 1858, Morphy, then only 21 years old, crossed the Atlantic and astounded European chess circles. Without even seeing the boards, he could play 10 chess games at the same time. And when he could see the pieces, Morphy was unbeatable. He soundly defeated even Adolf Anderssen, until then the best player in the world. Poor Anderssen was reduced to laughing with admiration at the helplessness of the plight of his own pieces when they met Morphy's armies. After defeating Europe's best, Morphy never played serious chess again. Back home in New Orleans, he tried without success to establish himself as a lawyer. And then, in the last years of his life, he developed paranoid delusions, including a fear of barbers. In 1884, he died. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the chess players didn't regain their composure until Morphy was buried. So it was that in 1886, two Europeans met in the first official match for the World Championship. Johannes Zukertort, aristocrat, linguist, swordsman and braggart, lost to Wilhelm Steinitz. The new champion was a cantankerous character. He spent the last year of his life in a madhouse. Emanuel Lasker was the man who beat him. A philosopher, a mathematician, Lasker stayed on top for 27 years, until the arrival of Capablanca, a Cuban prodigy whose talent was understood only by astrologers of the time, if even by them. The age of Capablanca and Lasker marked the end of an era dominated by the West. A revolution was on its way, which would change the face of the game. When Lenin brought communism to old Russia, he promised sport, culture and education for the masses. Chess incorporated all three. The Soviet leaders attacked what they called the degrading of chess under the corrupt influence of the Western European bourgeois café. With a 5-year plan for chess, the game would be politicized and purified. There would be shot brigades of chess players to bring it to the masses. And the masses responded with great enthusiasm. In the Soviet Union, chess was becoming as popular as football. When Capablanca visited Moscow in 1935, he was astounded at the progress their chess had made. Both in numbers and strength, the Soviet Union was well on the way towards becoming the greatest chess-playing nation on Earth. In a simultaneous display, Capablanca won less than half his games, and by that time he'd already lost his world title. The main goal of Soviet chess was to defeat the man who'd replaced him. Since 1927, the world champion had been Alexander Alekhine, himself a Russian, but a good czarist who'd fled after the revolution. The Soviets described Alekhine as a fascist renegade, but in fact he had no interest in politics. Alekhine loved women, cats, alcohol, and above all, chess. The Dutchman Max Erver won the title in 1935 from an Alekhine who seemed to be in a drunken haze, but Alekhine sobered up enough to regain the title 2 years later. And then in 1946, Alekhine died, and Mikhail Botvinnik won the tournament to find a new champion. The Soviet production line had started.
Mikhail Botvinnik was not yet world champion when he began training replacements. This is not surprising. He began exactly the same way at the School Children's Palace of Pioneers, and then came many tournaments and many victories. When Maestro Kmoch congratulated the young player on victory, he hardly thought that he was congratulating the future world champion. 15 years later, in the same hall, Grandmaster Erve shook the hand of this new chess king. This was the last time a foreigner took part in this ceremony. Subsequently, Botvinnik congratulated Smyslov, and Smyslov congratulated Botvinnik. Then Botvinnik congratulated Tal. A year later, Tal again congratulated Botvinnik, who relinquished the crown to Tigran Petrosyan. Only recently, the young Soviet Grandmaster Boris Spassky stormed the chess heights. True, he was unsuccessful. Still, the chess crown remained in the Soviet Union.
In 1969, Spassky finally did manage to take the title from Petrosian. He was the 5th consecutive Soviet world champion. Among them, they'd held the world title for nearly 20 years. But Boris Spassky became the first Russian to have to defend the Soviet chess empire against a real threat from outside. Bobby Fischer was a true chess prodigy. At the age of 14, he became United States champion. At 15, he was a grandmaster. When most children were still battling with their schoolwork, his battles were with champions like Mikhail Tal, the man whose fierce glare had caused one opponent to put on dark glasses for fear of being hypnotized. Even at this age, only Fischer's immaturity stood between him and a crack at the World Championship. The Danish Grandmaster Bent Larsen was his second at the Candidates Tournament in 1959. In Buenos Aires, 12 years later, Fischer pushed his way one step nearer the top, a match against Petrosian for the right to challenge Spassky for the world title. By now, Fischer already had the reputation for being difficult. More than once he'd walked out of tournaments or imposed impossible conditions. And he was difficult on the board too. Not even reading Tarzan stories saved Bent Larsen from being humiliated 6-0. And he was only one of the opponents Fischer left spiritually bruised. He only just beat Petrosian 6.5, 2.5. One more demonstration of his chess genius. Fischer was a scourge of Soviet players, both on the board and off it.
Yeah, well, the thing that I resent is, when I first started playing chess, to me the Russians were heroes. And they still are as chess players, and I used to study all their literature, and you know, those were most of the first books I read were Russian chess books. But the first time the Russians ever mentioned me, I remember I was 13, and they wrote about me. They said, there's this, talented young American player, and they showed this famous game I'd won against Donald Byrne. They called it the game of the century. Not the Russians, but the rest of the world. And they showed the game, but on top of the game they said, well, he's a very fine, talented young player, but all this publicity he's getting is sure to do damage to his character. And then sure enough, from then on, they started attacking my character. They prepared it then, and then they just started attacking my character. They never even met me or know anything about me, So this, and then, this kind of attitude has really turned me off.
Off the board, Fischer was a perfect nuisance. On it, he was a perfect gentleman, as even the battered Soviets would have agreed. He'd taken on the USSR single-handed and seemed to be winning. Boris Spassky alone was left to defend Soviet honor against the Fischer onslaught.
They just feel that it's their game and they're not going to let anybody have their title. They just believe in attacking me and using the players to, write nasty articles about me and rig games among themselves and this kind of thing. It's just pure propaganda, and it's just, and they don't believe in, they just believe that they have the title and the title belongs to them in perpetuity because it's theirs, and that's their attitude. And they don't have a kind of a sporting attitude. Their attitude should be, well, if he's the best, he should have the title, but that's not their attitude. They don't believe in giving foreigners a chance to play for the title.
Beating the Soviets became a total obsession, but Fischer was also a genuine eccentric. In one tournament, he'd even played his moves by telex, because the American government refused to let him go to Cuba in person. In all his battles, on and off the board, he was a true loner. Bobby Fischer trusted no one but himself.
Once more.
He lives alone, always in hotel rooms that seem barely larger than chessboards. The television set is his window on the world. Daytimes for his exercises, nighttimes for old movies. It is almost the only company he keeps. A lot of the time, he won't even answer his telephone. He's shy, suspicious of strangers. It took us nearly 6 months to persuade him to sit for this television portrait.
It took much more effort to drag Fischer to Reykjavik to meet Spassky. In fact, but for two things, the whole match might never have taken place. First, the English banker Jim Slater added £50,000 to the prize money, and then Henry Kissinger phoned him to appeal to Fischer's sense of patriotism.
Even this little thing with me and Spassky is sort of a microcosm of the whole world political situation. You always read about, they suggest the two world leaders should sort of fight it out hand to hand or something. This is kind of that kind of thing now. We're doing, instead of, with bombs, having it out over the board.
Hardly had Fischer arrived in Iceland, then he began to complain about the playing hall, the chairs, even the colour of the squares on the chessboard. He lost the first game. He then complained about the cameras and refused to play while they were there. He lost the second game, by default because he didn't turn up. Then Fischer started winning. Now it was Spassky's turn to complain. He thought he was being hypnotised by electronic rays. Physicists dismantled the chairs and light fittings and found 2 dead flies. Fischer went on winning. In the end, by a score of 12.5 to 8.5, he trounced Boris Spassky.
Maybe strange, but I have good recollections about my match against Bobby. I like that we didn't have direct fighting, direct conflict between us. That was indirect.
The new champion had always made it clear he was going to stay at the top.
I'd like to keep taking on all the top players to really prove that I am the best player in the world today. So when they go home that night, they can't kid themselves that they're so hot.
However, between 1972 and 1975, when he had to defend his title, Fischer didn't play a single game in anger. And in 1974, the rows began. In the end, exasperated by the disputes with the organisers, Fischer resigned their title.